The Alphas Vow. Livia Corbin had never believed in the stories about the moonbound court. The legend spoke of a hidden kingdom ruled by a beast who took his bride from the human world once every 100 years. But when she wandered too deep into the fog-covered woods, she found herself in a place that wasn't supposed to exist. The trees whispered in a language she didn't know. The ground pulsed beneath her feet. And then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward tall, imposing, his silver eyes filled with recognition. "I have waited long enough," he murmured, reaching for her hand. "You were promised to me before you were even born." Chapter 1. The Whispers of Blackwood Forest. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, a familiar comfort to Livia Corbin. At 58, she found solace in the solitude of Blackwood Forest, the sprawling wilderness that bordered her small, upstate New York town. It was a place where the noise of the world faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a hawk. Today, however, the familiar tranquility felt different, charged with an almost palpable energy she couldn't quite place. Livia had been coming to these woods since she was a girl, escaping the stifling expectations of her small-town life, the constant reminders of her late husband, Thomas, a man she'd loved deeply, but whose memory had become a gilded cage. She'd found a rhythm in her grief, a quiet acceptance that allowed her to move forward, but the echoes of what if still lingered, particularly on days like today, the anniversary of their first meeting. The fog, unusually thick for late afternoon, swirled around her ankles, clinging to the ancient trees like a lover's embrace. Livia, normally unfazed by the forest's moods, felt a prickle of unease. She pulled her worn woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, the familiar weight a small comfort against the growing chill. The light, filtering weakly through the dense canopy, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. She'd wandered further than usual, drawn by a faint, melodic sound she couldn't quite identify. It was like a whisper on the wind, a haunting tune that tugged at something deep within her, a forgotten memory struggling to surface. She'd always considered herself a practical woman, grounded in reality, a retired librarian who found joy in the order and predictability of books. Yet, here, in the heart of the darkening woods, the rational part of her mind seemed to be losing its grip. The stories her grandmother used to tell, dismissed as folklore, suddenly felt less fantastical. Tales of the moonbound court, a hidden kingdom ruled by a powerful, enigmatic being, a creature of myth and legend. Her grandmother, a woman with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries, had spoken of a pact, a centuries-old agreement between the human world and this hidden realm. Once every 100 years, the Alpha, the ruler of the moonbound court, would choose a bride from the human world, a woman destined to share his power and his fate. Livia had always scoffed at these tales, relegating them to the realm of childish fantasy. Now, with the fog closing in and the strange music weaving through the trees, she felt a tremor of doubt. Livia stopped, her hand resting on the rough bark of a towering oak. The air grew colder, the silence punctuated only by the frantic beating of her own heart. She felt watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes. A shiver ran down her spine, a primal fear she hadn't experienced since childhood. She turned slowly, scanning the swirling mist, her breath catching in her throat. Then she saw him. He emerged from the fog like a phantom, a figure sculpted from shadow and moonlight. Tall and imposing, he moved with a grace that was both predatory and mesmerizing. His hair was the color of raven's wings, falling around his shoulders in thick waves. But it was his eyes that held her captive, eyes of the purest silver, luminous and intense, reflecting a light that seemed to emanate from within. They held a depth of knowing, an ancient wisdom that made her feel both insignificant and strangely seen. He was dressed in clothes that seemed both ancient and timeless, dark, close-fitting trousers, a tunic of a deep forest green, and a cloak the color of midnight, fastened with a silver clasp shaped like a crescent moon. A silver ring, intricately carved with wolves and strange symbols, adorned his left hand. He exuded an aura of power, a raw, untamed energy that both terrified and captivated her. Livia tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but the words caught in her throat. Her carefully constructed world, the one built on logic and reason, was crumbling around her. She felt a strange pull towards him, a magnetic force that defied explanation. It was as if her very soul recognized him, acknowledged him as something more. He stopped a few feet away, his silver eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the whispering wind. Then he spoke, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around her. "I have waited long enough," he murmured, the words laced with a strange blend of weariness and possessiveness. He took a step closer, and Livia instinctively recoiled, a flicker of fear warring with a strange, undeniable fascination. He reached out a hand, his long, elegant fingers extended towards her. His touch, even before it connected with her skin, sent a jolt of energy through her, a wave of heat that spread through her veins like wildfire. "You were promised to me," he continued, his voice softer now, almost a caress, "before you were even born." Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. Promised? What did he mean? This was madness, a fever dream brought on by the fog and the unsettling atmosphere of the woods. She had to get away, to escape this hallucination. But as she tried to turn, to flee back into the familiar embrace of the forest, she found she couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the ground, her body unresponsive to her commands. It was as if an invisible force held her captive, binding her to this enigmatic stranger and the impossible truth he represented. The fog began to clear. Not to vanish, but to condense. It became the forest floor, the boughs of trees, and this strange, wonderful man's cloak. Chapter 2. A kingdom veiled in mist. The fog, now solidified into a tangible landscape, revealed a world utterly unlike anything Livia had ever imagined. Gone were the familiar pines and oaks of Blackwood Forest. In their place stood trees of impossible size and grandeur, their leaves shimmering with an ethereal silver light. The air hummed with a palpable energy, a vibrant pulse that resonated deep within her bones. It felt alive. The man, still holding her gaze with his mesmerizing silver eyes, gently took her hand. His touch, surprisingly gentle, sent another wave of that strange, compelling energy through her. It was no longer frightening, but rather intoxicating. A warmth spread through her, chasing away the lingering chill of the forest. "Welcome, Livia, to the moonbound court," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to blend with the rustling of the silver leaves. "To Sylvanus." Sylvanus. The name resonated with a power that echoed the strange, melodic sounds she had heard earlier. It felt both ancient and strangely familiar, as if it were a word she had known in a forgotten dream. He began to walk, leading her through this impossible landscape. Livia, still reeling from the shock of her sudden transportation, stumbled along beside him, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had ever believed. This couldn't be real. It had to be some elaborate illusion, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by what? Stress? Grief? The onset of some undiagnosed illness? Yet, the solidity of the ground beneath her feet, the cool, crisp air on her skin, the intricate detail of the flora and fauna around her, all of it felt undeniably real. She could smell the sweet, exotic fragrance of flowers she had never seen before, hear the chirping of unseen birds whose songs were unlike any she had ever heard. They walked in silence for a time, the man's presence a comforting constant beside her. He moved with an effortless grace, his body perfectly attuned to the rhythm of this strange, magical place. He seemed to anticipate every dip and turn in the path, his hand tightening slightly on hers whenever she stumbled. Livia finally found her voice, though it trembled slightly. Where are we? This isn't Blackwood Forest." He glanced at her, a flicker of amusement in his silver eyes. "No,
Livia.
This is beyond the veil, beyond the reach of your human world. This is the realm of the Moonbound, a kingdom that has existed alongside your own for millennia, hidden from sight, protected by ancient magic. Magic? Livia echoed, the word sounding absurd and yet strangely appropriate. But magic isn't real. He stopped, turning to face her fully. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch in her throat. Isn't it? He asked softly, his voice laced with a hint of challenge. You are standing here, Livia, in a place that defies your understanding, a place that exists only because of magic. You are feeling it, breathing it, experiencing it with every fiber of your being. He raised his free hand, and a small, shimmering orb of light appeared, hovering just above his palm. It pulsed with a soft, silver glow, illuminating his face in an ethereal light. Livia stared at it, mesmerized, her rational mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The world is full of things you humans have forgotten, he continued, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. Things you have dismissed as myth and legend. But they are real, Livia. And you are a part of them. The orb of light vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He lowered his hand, his gaze softening slightly. I know this is a lot to take in, he said, his voice gentler now. But I promise, I will explain everything. You are safe here. Safe? Livia wasn't so sure. She was in a strange, magical kingdom, led by a man who claimed she was promised to him before she was born. A man who was clearly not human, a being of immense power and mystery. She should be terrified, desperate to escape. Yet, a part of her, a deeply buried part that she hadn't even known existed, felt a strange sense of belonging. They continued their journey, eventually reaching a clearing bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that took Livia's breath away. It wasn't a castle, not in the traditional sense, but rather a sprawling, organic structure that seemed to have grown out of the very earth itself. It was crafted from shimmering white stone, interwoven with living vines and flowers, its towers reaching towards the sky like graceful, outstretched limbs. This is the heart of Sylvanus, the man said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. My home. And soon yours. Livia stared at the structure, her mind reeling. This was where she was supposed to live? With him? As his what? Bride? Queen? The words felt alien, and yet strangely compelling. As they approached the entrance, two figures emerged from the shadows. They were tall and powerfully built, with the same striking silver eyes as the man beside her. They were dressed in similar attire, though their cloaks were a deep forest green, and they carried themselves with an air of quiet authority. The man beside Livia nodded to them, a silent exchange of acknowledgement. These are my wardens, Kale and Lyra, he said, turning back to Livia. They are my most trusted advisors, and they will ensure your safety and comfort. Kale and Lyra bowed their heads slightly, their silver eyes assessing Livia with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Something that made her feel uneasy. It was as if they were weighing her, measuring her worthiness. Come, the man said, his hand still firmly clasped in hers. It is time you met the rest of the court. He led her through the entrance and into a vast, open-air courtyard, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Livia gasped, her eyes widening in astonishment. The courtyard was filled with people, or rather, beings that resembled people, but with an ethereal beauty that set them apart. They were all tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like moonlight and eyes that glowed with an inner light. They were dressed in flowing robes of various colors, their movements graceful and fluid. As they entered, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned towards them, their gazes filled with a mixture of curiosity, anticipation, and awe. Livia felt a blush creep up her cheeks, suddenly acutely aware of her own plainness, her ordinary clothes, her humanity. The man beside her, sensing her discomfort, squeezed her hand reassuringly. Do not be afraid, he whispered. They're here to welcome you. He raised his voice, his words echoing through the courtyard. My people, he announced, his voice ringing with authority, I present to you Livia Corbin, the woman who has been chosen to be my queen. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a murmur of excited whispers. Livia felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, her knees threatening to buckle. Queen? This was all happening too fast, too much to comprehend. She looked up at the man beside her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same. She heard him draw a sharp breath. Chapter 3. The Alphas Claim. The silence that followed his declaration was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that made Livia's skin prickle. Every eye in the courtyard was fixed on her, scrutinizing, assessing, waiting. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, her every flaw magnified, her every insecurity laid bare. The man she still didn't know his name squeezed her hand again, a silent reassurance that did little to quell the rising tide of panic within her.
Queen.
The word echoed in her mind, a concept so foreign, so utterly absurd, that she almost wanted to laugh. She, Livia Corbin, a retired librarian from a small town in upstate New York, queen of a magical kingdom? It was preposterous. He stepped forward, drawing her with him. The movement broke the spell, and a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Livia could hear snippets of their conversation, words spoken in a language she didn't understand, yet somehow felt in the vibrations of the air around her. It was a melodic language, full of lilting sounds and subtle inflections, both beautiful and strangely unsettling. She is human, she heard one voice whisper, the tone laced with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. So small, another voice murmured, so fragile. But the Alpha has chosen her, a third voice responded, this one carrying a note of awe. There must be a reason. Livia felt her cheeks burn with shame. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the shadows, to escape the weight of their collective gaze. But the man beside her held her firmly, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. He stopped before a raised platform at the far end of the courtyard, where a throne-like chair crafted from interwoven branches and flowers stood bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. It was a seat of power, a symbol of authority, and Livia felt a tremor of fear run through her as she realized what he intended. He turned to her, his silver eyes searching hers. Livia, he said, his voice low and intimate, a stark contrast to the formal pronouncements he had made moments before. I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to trust me.
Trust him?
How could she trust a man she barely knew, a man who had essentially abducted her from her life and brought her to this fairy tale? Yet, there was something in his eyes, a sincerity, a vulnerability, that tugged at her heart. She saw a flicker of something deeper, a hint of loneliness that mirrored her own.
What do you want from me?
She whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of worry etched around her eyes. His touch was warm, comforting, and sent a shiver of awareness through her. I want you to be my queen, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just in title, but in spirit. I need your strength, your wisdom, your humanity. He paused, his gaze searching hers. The moonbound court has grown stagnant, Livia. We have become isolated, trapped in our traditions, our ancient ways. We need a fresh perspective. We need you. Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. He was asking her, a woman who had spent her life surrounded by books, a woman who had retreated into the quiet solitude of her grief, to help him lead his kingdom? It was an impossible request, a burden she wasn't sure she could bear. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something more than just need. She saw hope, a glimmer of possibility, a chance for something more. And, against all reason, she felt a flicker of that same hope ignite within her own heart. She took a deep breath, steeling her resolve. I don't know anything about your world, she said, her voice stronger now. About your people. I don't know if I can be the queen you need. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the sharp angles and revealing a hint of the man beneath the regal facade. "You will learn," he said, "and I will be there to guide you, every step of the way." He turned back to the crowd, his hand still holding hers. "My people," he announced, his voice ringing with authority once more. "I have made my choice. Livia Corbin will be my queen. And I ask you, will you accept her?" The silence that followed was even more profound than before. Livia held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The fate of her future, of her very life, hung in the balance. Then, slowly, one by one, the members of the court began to bow. First Kale and Lyra, his wardens, their silver eyes filled with a grudging respect. Then, others followed, their movements graceful and fluid, their heads bowed in deference. The murmurs grew into a crescendo, a chorus of voices chanting a word she didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear: acceptance. The man beside her, her king, turned back to her, his eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and relief. "They accept you, Livia," he said softly. "You are now one of us." He gently led her towards the throne-like chair, the weight of his hand on her back both comforting and terrifying. As she sat, the woven branches seemed to mold themselves to her shape, embracing her, welcoming her. She felt a surge of power, a strange, unfamiliar energy that flowed through her veins, connecting her to this place, to these people, to him. He knelt before her, his silver eyes locking with hers. "I am Alaric," he said, finally revealing his name. "Alpha of the Moonbound Court, and your husband." The word hung in the air, heavy with significance. Husband. It was a word that held so much meaning, so much promise, and so much uncertainty. Livia looked out at the assembled court, at the faces of these strange, beautiful beings who were now her people. She looked at Alaric, her husband, her king, the man who had brought her to this impossible place and offered her an impossible future. She took a deep breath, the scent of the silver flowers filling her lungs, the hum of the moonbound court vibrating through her soul. She had a kingdom to learn, a people to lead, and a husband to understand. And, for the first time in a long time, Livia Corbin felt a spark of something she had thought long dead. Hope. A fragile, tentative hope, but hope nonetheless. As the moon rose, painting silver the tips of high towers, she could not shake a feeling that she had only really just met him. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Forgotten Pact. The night unfolded in a blur of introductions, unfamiliar customs, and a whirlwind of emotions Livia struggled to process. Alaric, ever attentive, remained by her side, guiding her through the intricacies of the moonbound court, explaining their traditions, their history, their magic. The feasting hall, a vast, open-air space adorned with shimmering crystals and glowing flora, was a spectacle of otherworldly beauty. The food, unlike anything Livia had ever tasted, was a symphony of exotic flavors and textures, each bite a revelation. The music, played on instruments she couldn't name, was haunting and ethereal, weaving its way into her very soul. Yet, despite the opulence and the warmth of Alaric's presence, Livia couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider, an imposter in a world she didn't belong. The members of the court, though polite and respectful, regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She could sense their unspoken questions, their doubts about her ability to fill the role Alaric had thrust upon her. She tried to engage in conversation, to learn more about their lives, their customs, but the language barrier proved a significant obstacle. Alaric translated when he could, but the nuances of their speech, the subtle inflections and unspoken meanings, were lost on her. She felt a growing sense of isolation, a familiar ache that resonated with the loneliness she had carried for so long. As the night wore on, Alaric led her to a private balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine and a hint of something wilder, something that reminded her of Alaric himself. "You are quiet, Livia," he said, his voice a low murmur in the stillness. He stood close, his presence a comforting warmth against the cool night air. Livia leaned against the railing, gazing out at the breathtaking vista before her. The gardens, bathed in the silvery glow of the moon, were a tapestry of shimmering light and shadow, a magical landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. I feel overwhelmed, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. This is all so much. I don't know if I can do this, Alaric. He turned to her, his silver eyes searching hers. You are stronger than you think, Livia, he said softly. I saw it in you, from the moment I met you. A resilience, a quiet strength that has been hidden, buried beneath your grief. His words struck a chord, resonating with a truth she had long tried to ignore. She had been strong, once. She had faced loss and heartbreak, had rebuilt her life, had found a way to carry on. But somewhere along the way, she had lost that strength, had retreated into the safety of her solitude. I used to be, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. But I'm not that person anymore. He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. His touch sent a shiver of awareness through her, a familiar warmth that chased away the lingering chill. You are still that person, Livia, he said, his voice firm but gentle. You just need to rediscover her. And I will help you. He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips. Livia felt her heart skip a beat, her breath catching in her throat. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, a magnetic pull that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He leaned closer, his eyes searching hers, asking a silent question. Livia's mind raced, a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, desire, uncertainty, hope, they all swirled within her, a chaotic symphony that threatened to overwhelm her. But then he hesitated. He drew back slightly, his gaze shifting away from her lips, a flicker of regret crossing his face. There is something you need to know, Livia, he said, his voice heavy with a seriousness that sent a chill down her spine. Something about the pact, the agreement that binds us together. Livia's heart sank.
The pact.
She had almost forgotten about it, lost in the whirlwind of her new surroundings, her new reality. But now, the weight of his words brought it crashing back, a stark reminder of the circumstances that had brought her here. What is it? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Alaric took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The pact between the moonbound court and the human world was forged centuries ago. He began, his voice a low, resonant rumble. It was a time of great conflict, of war between our two peoples. To prevent further bloodshed, an agreement was reached. Once every 100 years, the Alpha of the moonbound court would choose a bride from the human world, a woman who would share his power and his fate, ensuring peace and balance between our realms. He paused, his gaze shifting back to her. But there is more to the pact than just a symbolic union, Livia. There is a binding. A soul bond that connects the Alpha and his chosen bride on a level that transcends the physical. Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. A soul bond? What did that even mean? It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel, a concept she had always dismissed as mere fiction. What does that entail? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Alaric's expression was grave. It means that our souls are intertwined, Livia. Bound together by an ancient magic that is both powerful and unbreakable. We are connected on a level that goes beyond love, beyond desire, beyond choice. He paused, his gaze searching hers. It means that we can feel each other's emotions, sense each other's presence, even when we are apart. It means that we are one. Livia felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. This was too much, too fast. She couldn't comprehend the implications of what he was saying. A soul bond? It was a concept that defied logic, that challenged everything she had ever believed. But what if I don't want this? She whispered, her voice trembling. What if I don't love you? The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fear and uncertainty. Alaric's expression didn't change, but she could sense a flicker of pain in his eyes. The bond is not about love, Livia, he said softly. It is about connection. About destiny. It is a force that is beyond our control. He gave her a long, searching gaze, which ended on a soft, pained note. Chapter 5. The Weight of a Silver Crown. The revelation of the soul bond hung between them, a heavy, invisible weight that shifted the very air Livia breathed. The romantic notion of a magical kingdom, of being a queen, suddenly felt like a gilded cage, its beauty overshadowed by the inescapable reality of this connection. Alaric watched her, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and a quiet, unwavering resolve. He didn't try to reassure her, didn't offer empty platitudes about love or happiness. He simply acknowledged the truth, the stark reality of their situation. "I understand your fear, Livia," he said, his voice low and steady. "I know this is not what you wanted, not what you chose. But I promise you, I will not force you into anything. I will give you time, space, whatever you need to adjust." His words, though meant to be comforting, only heightened Livia's sense of unease. Time? Space? What good were those things when their very souls were intertwined, when she could feel his presence, his emotions, as if they were her own? She turned away from him, leaning heavily against the railing, her gaze fixed on the moonlit gardens below. The beauty of the landscape, once a source of wonder, now felt like a cruel mockery of her own inner turmoil. How can I be a queen when I'm bound to you like this?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "How can I lead your people when I don't even have control over my own fate?" Alaric moved closer, his presence a comforting warmth at her back. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of his body, the subtle energy that radiated from him. "The bond is not a shackle, Livia," he said softly. "It is a connection, a source of strength, of understanding. It can be a gift if you allow it to be." "A gift?" Livia almost laughed. It felt more like a curse, a burden she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to bear. She had spent her life valuing her independence, her autonomy, her ability to make her own choices. And now, that had all been taken away from her, replaced by this inescapable bond. "I need time to think," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I need to be alone." Alaric nodded, his expression understanding.
"Of course," he said.
"I will have chambers prepared for you. Take all the time you need." He turned to leave, but then hesitated. He turned back to her, his silver eyes searching hers. "Livia," he said softly, "I know this is difficult, but I believe in you. I believe in us. And I believe that, together, we can find a way to make this work." His words, spoken with such sincerity, such conviction, sent a flicker of warmth through the cold numbness that had enveloped her. A tiny spark of hope, fragile and tentative, ignited within her heart. He left, and Livia remained on the balcony, alone with her thoughts. The moon, high in the sky, cast its silvery light upon her, illuminating the tears that streamed down her face. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer the woman she had been yesterday. She was Livia Corbin, queen of the moonbound court, bound by an ancient magic to a man she barely knew, a man who was both her captor and her husband. The chambers prepared for her were lavish, opulent, a stark contrast to the simple, comfortable home she had left behind. The walls were adorned with shimmering tapestries, the floors covered with plush carpets, the furniture crafted from intricately carved wood and inlaid with precious stones. A massive four-poster bed, draped with silken curtains, dominated the room, its presence both inviting and intimidating. Livia wandered through the chambers, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of a marble table, the delicate embroidery of a velvet cushion. It was all so foreign, so unreal. She felt like an imposter, a trespasser in a world she didn't belong. She changed into a nightgown provided for her, a garment of soft, flowing silk that felt both luxurious and strangely constricting. She climbed into the bed, the silken sheets cool against her skin. But sleep eluded her. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, of unanswered questions, of unbidden images of Alaric, his silver eyes, his gentle touch, his unwavering gaze. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, the chaos, the reality of her situation. But even in the darkness, She could feel him, his presence, a subtle hum in the back of her mind, a constant reminder of the bond that connected them. She could sense his concern, his patience, his hope. And, against her will, she felt a flicker of something else. A warmth, a connection, a longing. It was a faint, tentative feeling, easily overshadowed by her fear and uncertainty. But it was there, nonetheless. A seed of possibility, planted in the fertile ground of her soul. She tossed and turned, her body restless, her mind unable to find peace. The weight of the silver crown, the symbol of her new status, felt heavy on her head, even though she wasn't wearing it. It was a weight of responsibility, of expectation, of destiny. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, Livia finally drifted into a fitful sleep. But even in her dreams, she was not alone. Alaric was there, his presence a constant, unwavering force, a reminder of the bond that bound them together, for better or for worse. The feeling intensified until she could nearly swear he lay next to her, breathing as softly as the mountain breeze. Chapter 6. Shadows in the Moonlit Glade. Livia awoke to the sound of birdsong, a melodic chorus that filtered through the open windows of her chambers. Sunlight streamed into the room, illuminating the opulent surroundings in a warm, golden glow. For a moment, she felt a sense of disorientation, a fleeting confusion as her mind struggled to reconcile the reality of her situation with the remnants of her dreams. She sat up in bed, the silken sheets pooling around her waist. The memory of the previous night, of Alaric's revelation, of the soul bond, washed over her, bringing with it a familiar wave of anxiety. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to center herself, to find some semblance of calm amidst the chaos. A soft knock on the door startled her. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. "Come in," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The door opened, and Lyra, one of Alaric's wardens, entered the room. She was tall and slender, with the same striking silver eyes as Alaric and Kale, her long, dark hair braided intricately down her back. She was dressed in a simple, elegant gown of deep forest green, her movements graceful and fluid. Lyra bowed her head slightly. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice respectful but reserved. "Alaric has requested that you join him for breakfast in the gardens." Livia nodded, her stomach twisting with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She hadn't seen Alaric since their conversation on the balcony the previous night, and she wasn't sure what to expect. Was he angry with her? Disappointed? Or something else? "Thank you, Lyra," she said, her voice steadier now. "Please tell him I will be there shortly." Lyra nodded again and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Livia climbed out of bed, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. She found a dressing gown laid out for her, a garment of soft, flowing velvet in a deep shade of blue. She slipped it on, the luxurious fabric feeling strangely comforting against her skin. She found Alaric waiting for her in a secluded corner of the gardens, a small table set for two amidst a profusion of blooming flowers. He was dressed in a simple tunic and trousers, his dark hair falling loosely around his shoulders. He looked up as she approached, his silver eyes softening as he met her gaze. "Livia," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I hope you slept well." Livia managed a weak smile. "As well as could be expected," she replied, her voice tinged with a hint of irony. He gestured towards the table.
"Please sit," he said.
"I thought we could talk." Livia sat down opposite him, her hands folded nervously in her lap. The table was laden with a variety of foods, fruits, pastries, and a steaming pot of something that smelled deliciously of herbs and spices. But Livia had little appetite. Her mind was too preoccupied with the conversation that was to come. They ate in silence for a few moments, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves. Alaric watched her, his gaze thoughtful and concerned. "Livia," he began, his voice serious but gentle. "I want to apologize for overwhelming you last night. I should have been more sensitive, more gradual in my explanation of the pact." Livia looked up at him, surprised by his apology. She had expected him to be defensive, perhaps even angry with her for her reaction. But he seemed genuinely remorseful. It's all right, she said, her voice hesitant. I needed time to process everything. He nodded, his gaze understanding. I know, he said. And I want you to know that I respect your feelings, your hesitations. I will not pressure you, Livia. I will give you the time and space you need. His words, though reassuring, did little to quell the underlying anxiety she felt. She knew that the bond, the connection between them, was not something she could simply ignore. It was a fundamental part of their reality, a force that would shape their lives whether she liked it or not. Alaric, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I don't understand this bond. I don't understand how it works, what it means for us. He leaned forward, his silver eyes locking with hers. It is difficult to explain in words, Livia, he said. It is something that must be felt, experienced. But I can tell you this. It is not a prison. It is a connection, a source of strength, of understanding. It can be a gift if we allow it to be. He paused, his gaze searching hers. The bond allows us to share each other's thoughts, emotions, even physical sensations, to a certain extent. It is a deep, intimate connection that transcends the boundaries of the physical world. Livia felt a shiver run down her spine. The thought of sharing such intimate aspects of herself with another person, especially someone she barely knew, was both terrifying and intriguing. But, Alaric, I am used to being alone. How do I reconcile that? He did not have an easy answer. Chapter 7. The Price of Defiance. Alaric's silence stretched, filled only by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of the court going about its morning rituals. He understood her question, understood the core of her fear. It wasn't just about the bond, but about the loss of the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself, the solitude that had become her refuge. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers, not quite touching. I know it's a daunting prospect, Livia, he said softly, his voice laced with a sincerity that reached deep within her. To surrender that independence, that control you've held onto so tightly. But the bond doesn't have to mean erasure. It doesn't mean you cease to be you. He paused, his silver eyes searching hers, trying to convey the depth of his understanding. It's about expansion. About allowing another person into your world, not to replace it, but to enhance it. To share it. Livia looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. His words, though comforting in theory, felt abstract, intangible. How could she possibly explain the quiet, solitary life she had built, the comfort she found in her own company, the peace she had cultivated in the absence of connection? I don't know if I can, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I've spent so long alone. It's become a part of me. Alaric nodded, his expression empathetic. I understand, he said. And I'm not asking you to change overnight. I'm not asking you to become someone you're not. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility, to be open to the potential of this bond. He withdrew his hand, leaving a lingering warmth where his presence had been. But there are practical matters we must discuss, Livia. Matters that affect the court, the stability of our realm. Livia looked up at him, her heart sinking. She knew what was coming. The responsibilities, the expectations, the demands of her new role. The weight of the crown, even without physically wearing it, felt heavier than ever. The court expects certain things from their queen, Alaric continued, his voice regaining its formal tone. There are traditions, ceremonies, rituals that must be observed. And there is the matter of an heir. The word hung in the air, heavy with significance. An heir. The continuation of the lineage, the securing of the future of the moonbound court. Livia felt a cold dread creep through her veins. It was one thing to accept the bond, to try to adapt to this strange, magical world. But to bear a child, to bring another life into this uncertainty, it was a responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready for. I don't know if I can do that, Alaric, she said, her voice trembling. I'm too old. It's been years since I even considered the possibility of. She trailed off, unable to voice the unspoken fears that swirled within her. The fear of loss, the fear of failure, the fear of repeating the past. Alaric's expression softened. He reached across the table again, this time taking her hand in his. His touch, warm and reassuring, sent a jolt of energy through her, a subtle reminder of the bond that connected them. "Livia," he said gently, "the moonbound are not like humans. Our lifespans are longer. Our bodies more resilient. Age is not the barrier it is in your world." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "And the bond itself enhances our abilities. It strengthens us, heals us, makes us more fertile." His words, though meant to be reassuring, only heightened Livia's anxiety. It felt like another layer of control being stripped away, another aspect of her life being dictated by this ancient magic. "But what if I don't want that?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "What if I can't give you an heir?" Alaric's expression didn't change, but she could sense a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He squeezed her hand gently. "The court will expect certain things," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "There will be pressure. But I will not force you, Livia. I will do everything in my power to protect you, to shield you from their expectations." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But defiance has a price, Livia. The old ways are deeply ingrained in our culture. There are those who will not understand, who will resist your presence, your influence. You will need to be strong, Livia. Stronger than you've ever been before." His words hung in the air, a stark warning of the challenges that lay ahead. Livia looked out at the beautiful gardens, at the peaceful serenity of the moonbound court. But beneath the surface, she could sense the undercurrents of tension, the whispers of doubt, the shadows of resistance.
She had a choice to make.
To embrace her new role, to accept the bond, to try to become the queen Alaric needed her to be. Or to defy the expectations, to resist the ancient ways, to risk the consequences. The weight of that choice pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She looked at Alaric, her husband, her king, the man who had brought her to this impossible place and offered her an impossible future. And she knew that, whatever she decided, her life would never be the same. She suddenly became aware that they were no longer alone. Cale stood at a distance, his silver eyes filled with a cold disapproval. Chapter 8. Scars of the Past. Cale's presence, silent and watchful, shattered the fragile intimacy that had begun to form between Livia and Alaric. His disapproval was palpable, a cold wave that washed over Livia, reminding her of her outsider status, of the challenges she faced in this new, unfamiliar world. Alaric, sensing her discomfort, released her hand. He straightened, his expression shifting from the gentle vulnerability he had shown moments before to the regal formality of the Alpha. "Cale," he said, his voice cool and commanding. "Is there something you require?" Cale approached, his movements graceful and precise. He bowed his head slightly to Alaric, then turned his gaze to Livia, his silver eyes assessing her with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. "My lord," he said, his voice respectful but laced with an undercurrent of challenge. "The elders have requested an audience. They wish to discuss the matter of the queen's integration into the court." Livia felt her stomach clench. The elders. The very word conjured images of ancient, powerful beings, steeped in tradition, resistant to change. She knew, instinctively, that this meeting would not be pleasant. Alaric nodded, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said. "Tell them I will meet with them shortly. And Cale," he added, his voice hardening slightly, "see to it that the queen is treated with the respect she deserves." Cale's gaze flickered to Livia, a flicker of defiance in his silver eyes. He bowed again, a perfunctory gesture that lacked any genuine warmth. "As you command, my lord," he said, and then turned and left, his footsteps echoing softly on the stone pathway. Alaric turned back to Livia, his expression softening. "Do not be afraid, Livia," he said gently. "The elders are set in their ways, but they are not unreasonable. I will be there with you." Livia managed a weak smile, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you, Alaric," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I can't help but feel like I'm walking into a trap." He reached across the table and took her hand again, his touch warm and reassuring. "It is not a trap, Livia," he said. "It is a test. A test of your strength, your resilience, your willingness to adapt." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "The elders hold great power within the court, Livia. They are the keepers of our traditions, the guardians of our history. They will not easily accept an outsider, especially one who challenges their beliefs." "And what are their beliefs?" Livia asked, her voice trembling slightly. Alaric's expression darkened. "They believe in the old ways, Livia," he said. "In the strict adherence to our traditions, in the separation of our world from the human realm. They believe that the Alpha should rule with absolute authority, that the Queen should be subservient, a vessel for the continuation of the lineage." Livia felt a cold dread creep through her veins. It was exactly as she had feared. She was an outsider, a threat to their established order, a challenger to their power. "And what do you believe, Alaric?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He looked at her, his silver eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. "I believe in balance, Livia," he said softly. "In the need for both tradition and progress. In the strength that comes from unity, not division. In the power of love, not fear." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I chose you, Livia, because I saw something in you that the court needs. A strength, a wisdom, a compassion that has been lost in our world. I believe that you can help us to evolve, to become stronger." His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a flicker of hope through the darkness of her fear. But she knew that the path ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges, with opposition. "But what about your own past?" she asked. "Your scars, your wounds. Will they become my burden, too, through this bond?" Alaric's expression flickered with pain, a shadow crossing his features. He withdrew his hand, his gaze dropping to the table. "My past is my own, Livia," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that spoke of centuries of burden. "It is not something I wish to inflict upon you. But the bond, it makes it difficult to hide things, to keep secrets." He looked up at her, his silver eyes filled with a vulnerability that made her heart ache. "I have made mistakes, Livia," he said softly. "I have done things I regret. I have lost things I cherished. And those scars, they run deep." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "But I am trying, Livia. I am trying to learn, to grow, to become a better leader, a better man. And I believe that, with your help, I can." His words, spoken with such honesty, such humility, touched her deeply. She saw the pain in his eyes, the burden of his past, the hope for a better future. And she realized that, despite her fear, despite her doubts, she was not alone in this. They were bound together, not just by magic, but by a shared vulnerability, a shared humanity. She had to gather her courage and prepare for the waiting council. He rose, and she knew it was time. Chapter 9. The Language of Wolves. The walk to the council chamber was a silent procession, Alaric leading the way with Livia a step behind, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The grandeur of the heart of Sylvanus, which had initially awed her, now felt oppressive, the shimmering walls and intricate carvings seeming to close in on her, amplifying her sense of being an outsider, an intruder in this ancient, powerful place. The corridors they traversed were lined with members of the court, their silver eyes following Livia with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and, in some cases, outright hostility. She could hear their whispers, the melodic but incomprehensible language of the moonbound swirling around her, adding to her feeling of isolation. Alaric, sensing her unease, slowed his pace, his hand brushing against hers, a silent offer of reassurance. But Livia couldn't bring herself to accept it. She felt a growing distance between them, a chasm created by the weight of their respective burdens, by the uncertainty of their future. The council chamber was a vast, circular room, its walls lined with towering windows that offered a breathtaking view of the surrounding forest. The ceiling was a dome of shimmering crystal, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow across the polished stone floor. In the center of the room, a large, circular table crafted from dark, Ancient withstood surrounded by 13 high-backed chairs. 12 of the chairs were occupied, filled by the elders of the moonbound court. They were a formidable presence, their faces etched with the wisdom and weariness of centuries, their silver eyes gleaming with an intensity that made Livia's skin prickle. They were dressed in flowing robes of various colors, each adorned with intricate symbols that, Livia assumed, represented their lineage, their status, their power. The 13th chair, positioned at the head of the table, remained empty. Alaric's seat. He gestured for Livia to stand beside him, and she reluctantly obeyed, her legs trembling beneath her. As Alaric took his seat, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to him, then to Livia, their gazes scrutinizing, assessing, judging. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint rustling of their robes. The elder seated to Alaric's right, a woman with long, white hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through Livia's very soul, spoke first. Her voice, though aged, was strong and resonant, filled with an authority that commanded attention. "Alpha," she said, her voice echoing through the chamber. "You have brought before us the human woman you have chosen as your queen. We have concerns." Alaric nodded, his expression calm and composed. "I understand, Elder Lyria," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "And I am here to address those concerns." The elder turned her gaze to Livia, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You are human," she said, the word laced with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "You are unfamiliar with our ways, our traditions, our magic. What makes you believe you are worthy to be queen of the moonbound court?" Livia felt her cheeks burn with shame. She had asked herself the same question countless times since arriving in this strange, magical kingdom. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was a librarian, a widow, a woman who had spent her life surrounded by books, not powerful, ancient beings. Alaric, sensing her distress, spoke for her. "Livia Corbin possesses qualities that the moonbound court needs, elders," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "She has strength, wisdom, compassion, a perspective that is different from our own. She can help us to grow, to evolve, to bridge the gap between our world and the human realm." The elders murmured amongst themselves, their voices a low, rumbling chorus of dissent. Livia could sense their skepticism, their resistance, their disapproval. Another elder, a man with a stern face and piercing eyes, spoke next. "The pact, Alpha," he said, his voice sharp and accusatory. "It dictates that the queen must be subservient, a vessel for the continuation of the lineage. Will this human accept her role? Will she obey?" Livia felt a surge of anger rise within her. Subservient? A vessel? She was not a possession, a tool to be used and discarded. She was a woman, with her own thoughts, her own feelings, her own will. She stepped forward, her chin lifted, her gaze meeting the elders directly. "I am not a vessel," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I am a woman, and I will not be subservient to anyone. I will be a queen, yes, but I will be a queen on my own terms." A gasp rippled through the chamber. The elders stared at her, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Livia had defied them, challenged their authority, their beliefs. Alaric, too, seemed surprised by her outburst. But there was a flicker of admiration in his eyes. He placed a hand on her arm, a silent gesture of support. Elder Lyria, her face etched with disapproval, spoke again. "You dare to speak to us with such disrespect, human?" she said, her voice cold and sharp. "You forget your place." Livia stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I know my place, Elder Lyria," she said. "It is beside my husband as his queen, and I will not be silenced. I will not be diminished. I will be a voice for change, for progress, for understanding." She realized she now spoke, with an eerie calm, the language of wolves. Alaric stared. Chapter 10. A glimmer of trust. The shock that rippled through the council chamber was palpable. Livia, a human, had not only defied the elders but had done so in their own language, the ancient tongue of the moonbound, a language she had never learned, never even heard spoken clearly until her arrival in Sylvanus. The elders exchanged stunned glances, their faces a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a dawning respect. Even Kale, who had been observing the proceedings from the shadows, his expression typically stoic and disapproving, seemed taken aback. Alaric, however, was the most surprised. He stared at Livia, his silver eyes wide with wonder, his hand still resting on her arm. The connection between them suddenly amplified, a surge of shared emotion flowing through the bond. He felt her fear, her defiance, her strength. But he also felt something else, something unexpected. The ancient magic of the moonbound, flowing through her, answering her call, accepting her claim. Livia herself was stunned. She hadn't consciously chosen to speak in the language of the moonbound. The words had simply come to her, flowing from her lips as naturally as if she had spoken them all her life. She felt a strange, unfamiliar power coursing through her veins, a connection to this land, to these people, to Alaric, that was deeper, more profound than anything she had ever experienced. Elder Lyria, recovering from her initial shock, narrowed her eyes, her gaze scrutinizing Livia with a newfound intensity. How is this possible? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of the other elders. The language of the moonbound is not learned. It is inherited. It is in our blood, in our souls. Alaric stepped forward, his voice calm and authoritative. The bond, elders, he said.
It is stronger than we realized.
It has awakened something within Livia, something ancient, something powerful. He turned to Livia, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and pride. You spoke the language of our ancestors, Livia, he said softly. The language of the wolves, the language of magic. Livia looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't understand what was happening, how she had suddenly gained this ability. But she knew one thing for certain. It had changed everything. It had shifted the balance of power, challenged the elders' assumptions, and forged a new connection between her and the moonbound court. The elders, realizing the significance of what had just transpired, began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices a low, rumbling chorus of discussion. Livia could sense their shift in attitude, their grudging respect, their acceptance. Elder Lyria, her face still etched with a mixture of skepticism and wonder, addressed Alaric again. Alpha, she said, her voice more respectful now. It seems we have underestimated the power of the bond. And the strength of your chosen queen. She paused, her gaze shifting to Livia. Perhaps there is more to this human than we realized. Perhaps she is worthy after all. Alaric nodded, his expression relieved. I believe she is, Elder Lyria, he said. And I believe she will prove it to you in time. He turned to Livia, his hand gently squeezing her arm. Come, Livia, he said softly. Let us leave the elders to their deliberations. He led her out of the council chamber, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished stone floor. As they walked, Livia felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, the adrenaline that had fueled her defiance fading, leaving her feeling drained and vulnerable. Alaric, sensing her fatigue, slowed his pace. He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. You were magnificent, Livia, he said, his voice filled with admiration. You stood up to the elders. You spoke your mind. You embraced the bond. Livia managed a weak smile. I don't know what came over me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It was like something else took control. Something powerful. He nodded, his gaze understanding. It was the magic, Livia, he said. The magic of the moonbound, flowing through you. It is a part of you now, a part of us. He paused, his gaze searching hers. I know this is all overwhelming, Livia, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. I will support you, guide you, help you to navigate this new world, this new power. His words, spoken with such sincerity, such conviction, sent a warmth through her, chasing away the lingering chill of the council chamber. She looked at him, her husband, her king, the man who had brought her to this impossible place and offered her an impossible future. And, for the first time since arriving in Sylvanus, She felt a glimmer of trust. A fragile, tentative trust, but trust nonetheless. "Thank you, Alaric," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know what I would do without you." He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face, softening the sharp angles and revealing the hint of the man beneath the regal facade.
"You are not alone, Livia," he said.
"You never will be again." He led her towards the gardens, towards the beauty and serenity of the moonbound court. And as they walked, hand in hand, Livia felt a sense of hope. A fragile, tentative hope, but hope nonetheless. A hope for a future together, a future bound by magic, by destiny, by love. She wasn't sure, but for the first time, she was willing to consider the possibility. He felt a gentle thought brush his mind. Her first, to him. Perhaps. Chapter 11. The Hunter's Snare. The days that followed Livia's unexpected display of power in the council chamber were a period of adjustment, of learning, of growing connection. The elders, though still wary, treated her with a newfound respect, their initial hostility replaced by a cautious curiosity. They began to include her in their discussions, to seek her input on matters of the court, to acknowledge her as their queen. Alaric, ever attentive, remained by her side, guiding her through the intricacies of moonbound culture, teaching her their customs, their history, their language. He spent hours with her in the gardens, in the library, in the quiet solitude of their chambers, sharing his knowledge, his experiences, his hopes for the future. Livia, in turn, began to open up to him, to share her own thoughts, her own feelings, her own fears. She told him about her life in the human world, about her late husband, Thomas, about her love of books, about her loneliness. She confessed her doubts, her insecurities, her uncertainty about her ability to fill the role he had thrust upon her. Alaric listened patiently, offering her comfort, reassurance, and a growing understanding. He didn't try to dismiss her fears, didn't offer empty platitudes about love or happiness. He simply acknowledged her feelings, validated her concerns, and offered his unwavering support. The bond between them deepened, strengthened by their shared experiences, by their growing trust, by their increasing vulnerability. They could feel each other's emotions, sense each other's presence, even when they were apart. It was a connection that was both exhilarating and terrifying, a constant reminder of their intertwined destinies. One evening, as they strolled through the moonlit gardens, Alaric turned to Livia, his expression serious. "There is something you should know, Livia," he said, his voice low and grave. "Something about the dangers that threaten our world." Livia's heart skipped a beat. She had sensed the undercurrents of tension, the whispers of concern, the shadows that lurked beneath the surface of the moonbound court's serene facade. But she had never dared to ask, afraid of what she might learn. "What is it, Alaric?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant forest. "There are hunters," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that spoke of centuries of conflict. "Humans who know about our existence, humans who hunt us. They believe we are monsters, creatures to be feared, to be exterminated." Livia felt a chill run down her spine. Hunters? It sounded like something out of a horror story, a nightmare from which she couldn't awaken.
"But why?"
she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would they hunt you?" Alaric's expression darkened. "Fear, Livia," he said. "Ignorance. They do not understand us. They do not want to understand us. They see only our power, our difference, and they fear it." He turned to her, his silver eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness. "They have been a threat to us for centuries, Livia," he said. "They have hunted us, killed us, driven us into hiding. And they are becoming bolder, more organized. They are a danger to us all, and especially to you." Livia felt a wave of fear wash over her. She was human, an outsider, a target. She was vulnerable, exposed, a liability to the very people she was supposed to lead. What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alaric placed a hand on her arm, his touch warm and reassuring. "We are not defenseless, Livia," he said. "We have our own ways of protecting ourselves." But we must be vigilant. We must be careful. He paused, his gaze searching hers. I will not let anything happen to you, Livia, he said, his voice firm and unwavering. I will protect you with my life. His words, spoken with such conviction, such love, sent a warmth through her, chasing away the lingering chill of fear. But she knew that his promise, though sincere, might not be enough. The hunters were a real threat, a danger that loomed over them, a shadow that threatened to engulf their world. The next day, as Livia was practicing her newfound ability to speak the language of the moonbound with Lyra in the gardens, a sudden commotion erupted near the edge of the forest. Shouts, cries, and the sounds of struggle filled the air. Lyra's head snapped up, her silver eyes widening in alarm. Hunters! She exclaimed, her voice sharp and urgent. They have breached the perimeter. Livia's heart pounded in her chest. The threat was no longer abstract, no longer a distant shadow. It was here, it was real, it was happening. Lyra grabbed Livia's arm, her grip firm and urgent. We must get you to safety, Your Majesty, she said.
Come.
She began to pull Livia towards the heart of Sylvanus, towards the safety of its walls. But Livia hesitated. She couldn't just run, couldn't just hide. Alaric was out there, somewhere, fighting, protecting his people. And she was his queen. She had a responsibility, a duty. No, Lyra, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I won't run. I won't hide. I have to help. Lyra stared at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and respect. Your Majesty, she said, you're not trained for this. You are human. You are vulnerable. Livia shook her head. I may be human, Lyra, she said, but I am also the queen of the moonbound court. And I will not abandon my people. I will not abandon Alaric. Lyra found her running toward, not away from, the sound of battle. Chapter 12. Blood and Betrayal. The scene that greeted Livia as she raced towards the edge of the forest was one of chaos and violence. Members of the moonbound court, their faces contorted with a mixture of fear and determination, were engaged in a fierce battle with a group of heavily armed humans, the hunters. The air was thick with the scent of blood, both human and other. The sounds of clashing steel, of growls and shouts, of agonized cries filled the air, creating a cacophony of violence that made Livia's stomach churn. She saw Alaric, his silver eyes blazing with fury, his body a blur of motion as he fought with a ferocity she had never witnessed before. He moved with an effortless grace, his claws and teeth tearing through the hunter's defenses, his every movement precise and deadly. But he was outnumbered. Several hunters surrounded him, their weapons trained on him, their faces grim and determined. Livia felt a surge of fear, a primal terror that threatened to overwhelm her. She had to do something, anything, to help him. She scanned the battlefield, her eyes searching for a way to intervene, to make a difference. She saw Lyra, fighting alongside Kale, their movements synchronized, their silver eyes gleaming with a fierce protectiveness. They were holding their own, but they were also outnumbered, surrounded by a growing number of hunters. Livia knew she couldn't stand idly by. She had to act, had to use the power that had awakened within her, the magic of the moonbound that flowed through her veins. She closed her eyes, focusing her mind, reaching deep within herself, searching for that connection, that source of strength. She felt it, a surge of energy that coursed through her body, tingling in her fingertips, humming in her ears. She opened her eyes, her vision sharpened, her senses heightened. She could see the hunters, their movements, their intentions, with a clarity she had never experienced before. She raised her hand, instinctively, and spoke a word in the language of the wolves, a word of power, a word of command. The air around her shimmered, crackled with energy. A wave of force emanated from her, sweeping across the battlefield, knocking the hunters off their feet, disarming them, throwing them back into the forest. The members of the moonbound court, stunned by this unexpected display of power, paused in their fighting, their eyes widening in disbelief. Alaric, too, turned towards her, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of awe and pride. But the respite was brief. The hunters, recovering from their initial shock, regrouped, their faces contorted with anger and fear. They had underestimated her, underestimated the power of the moonbound queen. But they were not defeated. One of the hunters, a tall, muscular man with a scarred face and cold, calculating eyes, stepped forward. He raised his weapon, a crossbow loaded with a silver-tipped arrow, and aimed it directly at Livia. "You may have power," which, he snarled, his voice filled with hatred. "But you are still human. And humans bleed." Livia stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was vulnerable, exposed, a target. But she refused to show fear. She stood her ground, her chin lifted, her gaze unwavering. Before the hunter could release his arrow, a figure leaped in front of Livia, shielding her from the deadly projectile. It was Kale, his silver eyes blazing with a fierce protectiveness, his body tensed, ready to take the blow. The arrow struck him in the shoulder, piercing his flesh, drawing a cry of pain from his lips. He staggered, but he did not fall. He turned to Livia, his face contorted with agony, his voice a strained whisper. "Run, your majesty," he gasped.
"Get to safety."
Livia stared at him, her eyes wide with horror. Kale, who had always resented her, who had always doubted her, had just saved her life. He had sacrificed himself to protect her, a human, an outsider. Before she could react, Alaric was there, his eyes blazing with fury. He lunged at the hunter who had shot Kale, his claws tearing through flesh and bone, his movements swift and deadly. The hunter fell to the ground, his body lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Alaric turned to Livia, his face a mask of rage and grief. "Take Kale," he commanded, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Get him to safety. I will deal with the rest." Livia nodded, her mind reeling. She knelt beside Kale, her hands trembling as she tried to assess his wound. It was deep, serious, and he was losing blood rapidly. Lyra appeared beside her, her face pale with concern. "We must get him to the healers," she said urgently.
"Quickly."
Together, they lifted Kale, his body heavy and limp, and carried him towards the heart of Sylvanus, leaving Alaric to face the remaining hunters alone. As they reached the safety of the walls, Livia looked back, her heart aching with fear and guilt. She saw Alaric, surrounded by enemies, fighting with a desperate ferocity, his body covered in blood, both his own and his enemies'. She knew he was strong, powerful, but he was also vulnerable. And she had a terrible feeling that this battle, this betrayal was far from over. The taste of copper filled her mouth. Her own blood. She had bitten through her lip. Chapter 13. The Unveiling of Secrets. The healers worked tirelessly to save Kale's life, their skilled hands and ancient magic battling against the poison that coursed through his veins, a cruel addition to the silver-tipped arrow. Livia paced restlessly outside the healing chambers, her heart heavy with guilt and worry. She had been the target, and Kale, who had openly shown his disdain for her, had taken the blow meant for her. Alaric eventually joined her, his body weary, his clothes stained with blood, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of relief and lingering anger. He had driven back the remaining hunters, but the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the near loss of his most trusted warden and the unsettling realization that the hunters had penetrated so deeply into their territory.
"How is he?"
Alaric asked, his voice hoarse. Livia shook her head.
"They don't know yet," she said, her voice trembling.
"The poison is strong. They're doing everything they can." Alaric leaned against the wall, his gaze fixed on the closed doors of the healing chambers. He closed his eyes, his face etched with exhaustion and pain. The bond between them pulsed, a throbbing ache of shared anxiety and a growing sense of dread. "There is something different about those hunters," Alaric said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Their weapons, their tactics, they were more organized, more knowledgeable than before. It was as if they knew our weaknesses." Livia felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?"
she asked.
Alaric opened his eyes, his gaze searching hers. "I mean, I think there is a traitor among us, Livia," he said, his voice heavy with suspicion. "Someone who is feeding information to the hunters, someone who helped them to breach our defenses." Livia stared at him, her mind reeling. A traitor? Within the moonbound court? It seemed impossible, unthinkable. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The hunters' knowledge, their precision, their timing, it all pointed to an inside source. But who? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Who would betray their own people? Alaric shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "But I intend to find out. And when I do, they will face the full force of my wrath." His words, spoken with such cold fury, sent a shiver of fear through Livia. She had seen Alaric's power, his ferocity, his capacity for violence. She knew that he would stop at nothing to protect his people, to avenge Cale's near death. Hours later, the doors to the healing chambers opened, and Elder Lyria emerged, her face etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "He will live," she said, her voice weary but firm. "The poison has been neutralized, and his wound is healing. But he is weak, and he will need time to recover." Alaric and Livia rushed inside, their hearts pounding with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. Cale lay on a bed of soft furs, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow but steady. He was unconscious, but his silver eyes flickered open as they approached. He looked at Livia, his gaze weak but surprisingly gentle. "Your Majesty," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're safe." Livia knelt beside him, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his arm. "Cale," she said, her voice choked with emotion. You saved my life. I don't know how to thank you." A flicker of a smile crossed his lips. "No thanks needed," he whispered. "I did my duty." He closed his eyes, his breathing becoming more regular. Alaric placed a hand on his shoulder, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and respect. "Rest now, Cale," he said softly. "You have earned it." As they left the healing chambers, Alaric turned to Livia, his expression grave. "We need to talk," he said. "There are things you need to know, secrets that have been kept hidden for too long." He led her to his private study, a room filled with ancient books, maps, and artifacts, a place where he could speak freely, without fear of being overheard. He closed the door behind them, sealing them in a world of shadows and unspoken truths. "The hunters, Livia," he began, his voice low and intense. "They are not just random groups of fanatics. They are organized, funded, and led by a powerful force, a force that has been our enemy for centuries." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "They call themselves the Silver Covenant," he said. "And their goal is not just to hunt us, but to eradicate us, to wipe the moonbound from the face of the earth." Livia felt a cold dread creep through her veins. The Silver Covenant. It sounded ominous, powerful, a threat that was far greater than she had ever imagined. "But why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why do they hate us so much?" Alaric's expression darkened. "It is a long and complicated story, Livia," he said. "A story of betrayal, of bloodshed, of ancient hatreds. A story that begins with my ancestors." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor, his face etched with a pain that Livia could feel through the bond, a deep, searing ache that resonated within her own soul. "My grandfather, the Alpha before me, was betrayed," he said, his voice heavy with grief and anger. "Betrayed by someone he trusted, someone he loved. And that betrayal led to the slaughter of many of our people, to the near destruction of our kingdom." The revelation hung in the air. Alaric looked as if he could tell her more, but something held him back. Chapter 14. Flight through the ancient woods. Alaric's revelation, though incomplete, sent a shockwave through Livia, adding another layer of complexity to the already tangled web of secrets and betrayals that surrounded the moonbound court. The weight of his ancestors' past, the pain of their losses, the burden of their legacy, it all resonated within her, amplified by the bond that connected them. He paced restlessly, his hands clenched into fists, his silver eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and regret. He wanted to tell her everything, to unburden himself of the secrets he had carried for so long. But he hesitated, fearing the consequences, fearing her reaction. "There's more, isn't there?" Livia asked, her voice soft but insistent. She could feel his turmoil, his hesitation, his fear. Alaric stopped pacing, his gaze meeting hers. He saw the understanding in her eyes, the empathy, the unwavering support. And he knew he couldn't keep it from her any longer. "The betrayal, it was not just a political act, Livia," he said, his voice heavy with a grief that seemed to span centuries. "It was personal. My grandfather, he loved a human woman. He trusted her. He shared our secrets with her. And she betrayed him to the Silver Covenant." Livia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The parallels to her own situation were striking, unsettling. She was a human woman, loved by an alpha, privy to the secrets of the moonbound court. Could history repeat itself? Could she, unknowingly, be a threat to the very people she was supposed to protect?
But why?
She whispered, her voice trembling. Why would she betray him? Alaric shook his head, his expression filled with a pain that Livia could feel through the bond, a deep, searing ache that resonated within her own soul. "I don't know, Livia," he said. "I have searched for answers, for explanations, for centuries. But I have found nothing. Only silence. Only betrayal." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "The Silver Covenant, they used her, Livia. They manipulated her, they twisted her love into a weapon. And they used that weapon to destroy my family, to decimate our people." Livia felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The cruelty, the inhumanity of it all, it was almost too much to bear. She reached out and took Alaric's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "I'm so sorry, Alaric," she said, her voice choked with emotion. I can't imagine the pain you must have endured." He squeezed her hand, his gaze locking with hers. "I tell you this, Livia, not to burden you, but to warn you," he said. "The Silver Covenant is still out there. They are still hunting us. And they will stop at nothing to achieve their goals." He paused, his expression grave. "And they may be watching you, Livia. They may be waiting for an opportunity to use you, just as they used her." Livia felt a chill run down her spine. The thought of being manipulated, of being used as a weapon against Alaric, against the moonbound court, it was terrifying. What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alaric's expression hardened. "We must be vigilant, Livia," he said. "We must be careful. We must trust no one, except each other." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "And we may need to leave Sylvanus, Livia. We may need to go into hiding, to protect ourselves, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation." Livia's heart sank. Leave Sylvanus? Leave the only home she had known in this strange, magical world? It was a daunting prospect, a terrifying unknown. But she knew he was right. They were not safe here, not anymore. Where would we go?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Alaric's gaze drifted towards the window, towards the ancient forest that surrounded the heart of Sylvanus. "There are places, Livia," he said, "hidden places known only to a few. Places where we can disappear, where we can regroup, where we can plan our next move." He turned back to her, his silver eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We will leave tonight, Livia," he said. "Under the cover of darkness. We will take only what we need, and we will vanish into the woods." Livia nodded, her mind racing. She had to be strong, had to be brave. She had to trust Alaric, had to trust the bond that connected them. She had to survive. As night fell, they prepared for their flight. Livia packed a small bag with essentials, her hands trembling as she chose what to take, what to leave behind. She felt a pang of sadness, of loss, as she looked around her chambers, at the opulence, the beauty that she had only just begun to appreciate. Alaric, too, was preparing, gathering weapons, maps, and supplies. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his every action precise and deliberate. He was a warrior, a leader, a king. And he was ready to fight for his survival, for their survival. As they slipped out of the heart of Sylvanus, under the cloak of darkness, Livia looked back at the shimmering walls, at the towers that reached towards the moonlit sky. She didn't know if she would ever see this place again, if she would ever return. They entered the ancient woods, the trees towering above them, their branches intertwining, creating a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air was cool and damp, filled with the scent of pine needles and something else, something wild, something untamed. Alaric led the way, his senses heightened, his body alert to any sign of danger. He moved with an effortless grace, his footsteps silent on the forest floor. Livia followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of pursuit. They were fleeing, running for their lives, hunted by an enemy they could not see, an enemy that lurked in the darkness, waiting to strike. But they were not alone. They had each other. And they had the bond, the ancient magic that connected them, the hope for a future that, for now, remained uncertain. She stumbled, and his arm shot out to steady her. They had to keep moving. Chapter 15. The Heart's True North. The journey through the ancient woods was arduous and fraught with peril. Alaric, drawing upon his centuries of knowledge and his innate connection to the land, guided them through treacherous terrain, avoiding known hunter paths and seeking refuge in hidden glades and forgotten caves. Livia, despite her initial fear and exhaustion, proved to be a resilient and resourceful companion, her city-bred instincts surprisingly adaptable to the harsh realities of the wilderness. They spoke little, conserving their energy and minimizing the risk of detection. Their communication was primarily through the bond, a silent exchange of emotions, of reassurance, of growing affection. Livia found comfort in Alaric's presence, in his unwavering strength, in his fierce protectiveness. She could feel his constant vigilance, his determination to keep her safe, his love. The word, unspoken, unacknowledged, hung between them, a fragile bloom in the harsh landscape of their flight. Livia had never allowed herself to consider the possibility of loving Alaric, of truly embracing the bond that connected them. She had been too afraid, too focused on survival, too burdened by the weight of her responsibilities. But here, in the heart of the ancient woods, stripped of the trappings of royalty, of the expectations of the court, she began to see him, not just as her king, her captor, her husband by fate, but as a man. A man with scars, with vulnerabilities, with a deep capacity for love. One evening, as they huddled around a small, carefully concealed fire, Livia found herself studying Alaric's face, illuminated by the flickering flames. She saw the lines of weariness etched around his eyes, the subtle shadows that spoke of his past burdens, the unwavering strength that radiated from him. "Alaric," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the crackling fire. "Tell me about your life. Before me." He looked up, his silver eyes meeting hers. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching hers, as if weighing the risks of revealing too much, of opening himself up to further pain. "It is a long story, Livia," he said, his voice low and husky. "We have time," she replied, her hand reaching out to touch his, a silent offer of comfort, of understanding. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver of awareness through her. He began to speak, his voice a low murmur that blended with the sounds of the night, telling her of his childhood, of his training, of his responsibilities as the heir to the moonbound throne. He spoke of his love for his people, of his desire to protect them, of his struggles to live up to the expectations of his ancestors. He spoke of his loneliness, of his isolation, of his longing for a connection, a love that he had never believed possible. He did not speak of the human woman who had betrayed his grandfather, the woman who had caused so much pain, so much loss. Livia sensed the unspoken grief, the lingering wound that still festered within him. As he spoke, Livia felt her heart opening to him, her fear and uncertainty gradually replaced by a growing empathy, a deepening affection. She saw the man beneath the regal facade, the vulnerable soul beneath the warrior's armor. And she realized that she was falling in love with him. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless and disoriented. She had fought against the bond, resisted the connection, tried to maintain her distance. But here, in the heart of the wilderness, stripped of all pretense, all expectations, she could no longer deny the truth. She loved him, not just because of the bond, not because of her duty, not because of fate, but because of who he was. His strength, his compassion, his vulnerability, his love for her. She tightened her grip on his hand, her gaze locking with his. "Alaric," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She hesitated, unsure of how to express the depth of her feelings, the overwhelming realization that had changed everything. He saw the emotion in her eyes, the unspoken words that hung in the air between them. He leaned closer, his gaze searching hers, asking a silent question. Livia closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss of discovery, of surrender, of unconditional love. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, not just as alpha and queen, but as man and woman, as soulmates. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The night was silent, save for the beating of their hearts, the soft murmur of their breaths, the whispers of their love. They had found each other, in the heart of the ancient woods, in the midst of their flight, in the face of danger. And, for the first time since Livia had entered this strange, magical world, she felt a sense of belonging, a sense of peace, a sense of coming home. The direction was now clear. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm. Their newfound intimacy, forged in the crucible of their shared flight, transformed their journey. The fear and uncertainty remained, the threat of the Silver Covenant a constant shadow looming over them, but their connection, their love, became a source of strength, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. They continued their trek through the ancient woods, Alaric guiding them with his innate knowledge of the land, Livia supporting him with her growing understanding of the moonbound magic, her ability to sense danger, to communicate with the very forest itself. They discovered hidden pathways, ancient ruins, places of power that had been forgotten for centuries. They learned to live off the land, to hunt and gather, to survive. They shared stories, dreams, fears, and love. One day, as they rested beside a crystal-clear stream, Alaric turned to Livia, his expression serious. "We are nearing our destination, Livia," he said. "A place called Whisperwind Glade. It is a sanctuary, a place of ancient power, protected by magic that even the Silver Covenant cannot penetrate." Livia's heart lifted with hope. A sanctuary? A place of safety, of peace? It seemed too good to be true, after the weeks of relentless flight, of constant fear. How is it protected?" she asked, her voice curious. Alaric smiled, a rare and precious sight. "It is a place where the veil between worlds is thin, Livia," he explained, "where the magic of the moonbound is strongest. The very air shimmers with power, the trees whisper secrets, the spirits of our ancestors guard its borders." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "It is also a place of testing, Livia," he added, his voice more serious now. "A place where we must confront our fears, our doubts, our past. A place where we will be tested, both individually and together." Livia felt a tremor of apprehension. A place of testing? What did that mean? What challenges awaited them? "I'm not afraid, Alaric," she said, her voice firm, though her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "As long as we are together, I can face anything." He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "We are together, Livia," he said. "Always." They continued their journey, the air growing thicker with magic, the trees whispering louder, the sense of anticipation building with every step. Finally, they reached a clearing, bathed in an ethereal light, the air shimmering with an almost visible energy. Whisperwind Glade. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a haven of peace and tranquility. A crystal-clear waterfall cascaded down a cliff face, feeding a pool of shimmering water surrounded by lush vegetation and flowers of vibrant colors. The air hummed with a palpable energy, a vibrant pulse that resonated deep within Livia's bones. But as they entered the glade, Livia felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in the energy. The air grew heavier, the whispers of the trees more insistent, the sense of anticipation turning into apprehension. Suddenly, figures emerged from the shadows, surrounding them, their silver eyes gleaming with an intensity that made Livia's skin prickle. They were not hunters, not members of the Silver Covenant. They were moonbound. But they were not from Sylvanus. They were taller, more powerfully built, their features sharper, their expressions fiercer. They were dressed in leather and furs, their bodies adorned with ancient symbols, their weapons drawn and ready. Alaric stepped forward, his body tensed, his hand reaching for the sword at his side. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice ringing with authority. "And what is your purpose here?" The leader of the group, a woman with long, black hair and eyes that blazed with silver fire, stepped forward. She looked at Alaric, then at Livia, her gaze scrutinizing, assessing. "We are the guardians of Whisperwind Glade, Alpha of Sylvanus," she said, her voice strong and resonant. "And you have entered our territory uninvited." Alaric's expression hardened. "We seek sanctuary," he said. "We are fleeing from the Silver Covenant, from enemies who threaten our very existence." The woman's gaze flickered to Livia, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And who is this human?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Why have you brought her to this sacred place?" Alaric placed a protective hand on Livia's arm. "She is my queen," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "She is bound to me, by magic, by fate. And she is under my protection." The woman's expression didn't change, but Livia could sense a flicker of something in her eyes. Understanding? Respect? Or something else? "The glade is a place of testing, Alpha," the woman said. "A place where only the worthy may enter. You and your queen will be tested. And if you are found wanting, you will be turned away." Livia felt a surge of fear, but she stood her ground, her chin lifted, her gaze meeting the woman's directly. "We are ready," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We will face whatever challenges await us." The guardians exchanged glances. The air itself seemed to crackle in anticipation. Chapter 17. A bond forged in fire. The tests began almost immediately, subtle at first, then escalating in intensity and danger. The guardians of Whisperwind Glade, led by the formidable Lyra look-alike, whose name was revealed to be Nyx, were relentless in their scrutiny, pushing Alaric and Livia to their physical and emotional limits. The first test was of physical endurance. They were forced to navigate treacherous terrain, climb sheer cliffs, swim through icy waters, all while being pursued by phantom wolves, creatures conjured by the glade's magic, designed to test their speed, their agility, their will to survive. Livia, despite her initial lack of experience, proved to be surprisingly resilient, her determination fueled by her love for Alaric, her growing connection to the moonbound magic. She drew upon her inner strength, her city-bred resourcefulness, and surprised even herself with her ability to adapt, to endure. Alaric, of course, excelled in the physical challenges, his centuries of training and his innate alpha strength giving him a clear advantage. But he never left Livia's side, always watching out for her, encouraging her, protecting her, loving her. The second test was of mental fortitude. They were subjected to illusions, to visions of their deepest fears, their greatest regrets, their most profound losses. Livia was forced to confront the memory of Thomas, her late husband, the pain of his loss, the guilt she still carried. She saw him, standing before her, his face as clear and vivid as if he were truly there. He spoke to her, his voice filled with love and sadness. He told her he was proud of her, that he wanted her to be happy, that he released her from the bonds of their past. Livia wept, tears streaming down her face, her heart aching with a grief that had never truly healed. But as she looked at Thomas, at the illusion of him, she realized that he was right. She had to let go, had to move on. She had to embrace her new life, her new love, her new destiny. She reached out and touched the illusion, her fingers passing through the shimmering image. "Goodbye, Thomas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I will always love you, but I have to let you go." The illusion faded, leaving Livia with a sense of peace, of closure, of renewal. She had faced her past, confronted her grief, and emerged stronger, more whole. Alaric, too, was tested. He was forced to confront the memory of his grandfather's betrayal, the slaughter of his people, the loss of his loved ones. He saw the human woman, the one who had caused so much pain, so much destruction. He saw her face, her eyes filled with malice, with hatred. He raged, he fought, he despaired. He wanted to kill her, to avenge his family, to erase the pain that had haunted him for centuries. But as he looked at the illusion, at the phantom of his past, he realized that he couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't bring back his loved ones, couldn't undo the betrayal. He had to let go of his anger, his hatred, his desire for revenge. He had to focus on the future, on protecting his people, on building a new life with Livia. He turned away from the illusion, his heart heavy but free. He had faced his past, confronted his demons, and chosen love over hate, hope over despair. The final test was of their bond, of their connection, of their love. They were separated, placed in different parts of the glade, and forced to navigate a labyrinth of illusions, of traps, of dangers, relying solely on their bond to guide them, to protect them, to reunite them. Livia found herself wandering through a maze of shifting pathways, surrounded by whispering voices, by flickering images, by false promises. She felt lost, disoriented, alone. But she could also feel Alaric, his presence a constant reassurance, a beacon in the darkness. She focused on his emotions, on his love, on his determination. She followed his lead, trusting in their connection, in their bond. She navigated the labyrinth, avoiding the traps, resisting the illusions, her heart set on reuniting with him. Alaric, too, was struggling. He was surrounded by visions of Livia in danger, of her being captured, tortured, killed by the Silver Covenant. He fought against the illusions, his heart pounding with fear, his determination fueled by his love for her. He followed her presence, her essence, the thread of their bond that connected them. He navigated the labyrinth, his every step guided by his love, his hope, his faith in their connection. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they found each other. They met in the center of the labyrinth, their eyes locking, their hands reaching out, their bodies embracing. They had passed the test. They had proven the strength of their bond, the depth of their love, the power of their connection. Nyx and the guardians of Whisperwind Glade appeared, their expressions no longer hostile, but respectful, even approving. "You have passed the tests, Alpha of Sylvanus," Nyx said, her voice strong and clear. "You and your queen have proven yourselves worthy. You may remain in Whisperwind Glade for as long as you need. You're safe here." Alaric and Livia looked at each other, their hearts filled with relief, with gratitude, with love. They had faced their fears, confronted their past, and emerged stronger, more united, more in love than ever before. They had found sanctuary, not just in Whisperwind Glade, but in each other. Their bond, forged in fire, was now unbreakable. The trials, however, were obviously not over. They saw a light in the distance. Chapter 18. The Reckoning. The light, emanating from a hidden cave deep within Whisperwind Glade, pulsed with an ancient, powerful energy. It drew Alaric and Livia towards it, a siren's call that resonated with the very core of their bond, promising answers, revelations, and perhaps more challenges. As they approached the cave entrance, the air grew thick with anticipation, the whispers of the trees intensifying, the presence of the glade's ancient magic becoming almost palpable. Livia felt a mixture of trepidation and excitement, a sense that they were on the verge of a significant discovery, a turning point in their journey. Inside the cave, the light emanated from a large, crystalline structure that dominated the center of the chamber. The crystal pulsed with a soft, silver glow, illuminating the cave walls, revealing intricate carvings, ancient symbols, and images that seemed to shift and change with the light. As they drew closer, Livia realized that the images depicted the history of the moonbound court, the story of their ancestors, the pact with the human world, the betrayal that had shattered their kingdom. She saw Alaric's grandfather, his face noble and strong, his eyes filled with love for the human woman who would ultimately betray him. She saw the Silver Covenant, their faces contorted with hatred, their weapons stained with the blood of the moonbound. But there was something else, something unexpected. As the images shifted and changed, Livia saw a figure that made her heart stop. It was a woman, a human woman, but she was not the betrayer. She was familiar. She looked like Livia. Alaric, too, saw the image. He gasped, his body tensing, his silver eyes widening in disbelief. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. The image shifted again, revealing more details. The woman was dressed in ancient clothing, similar to that worn by the moonbound, but she held a silver dagger in her hand, a dagger that Livia recognized. It was the same dagger that Alaric had given her, the dagger that had belonged to his ancestors, the dagger that was a symbol of their bond. The woman in the image was not attacking the moonbound. She was defending them. She was fighting against the Silver Covenant, her face fierce and determined, her body a blur of motion. She was a protector, a warrior, a heroine. Livia felt a surge of recognition, a connection to this woman, this ancestor. She realized, with a growing sense of wonder and awe, that she was not just a descendant of the human world, but also of the moonbound. She was a part of their history, their legacy, their destiny. The crystal pulsed again, and the image shifted, revealing a final scene. The woman, wounded and exhausted, stood before Alaric's grandfather, her hand outstretched, offering him the silver dagger. He took it, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. The image faded, leaving Livia and Alaric staring at the crystal, their minds reeling, their hearts pounding with the weight of this revelation. She was one of us," Livia whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "She was a protector, not a betrayer." Alaric nodded, his gaze fixed on the crystal. "The history, it was distorted," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and relief. "The Silver Covenant, they twisted the truth. They lied about her. They used her memory to fuel their hatred." He turned to Livia, his silver eyes filled with a newfound understanding, a deeper connection. "You are her descendant, Livia," he said. "You carry her blood, her strength, her spirit. You are the fulfillment of the pact, the true queen of the moonbound." Livia felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of pride, of responsibility, of love. She was not just an outsider, an imposter, a human. She was a part of this world, a part of its history, a part of its future. But the revelation also brought with it a new sense of danger. If the Silver Covenant had distorted history, had lied about Livia's ancestor, what else were they hiding? What other secrets did they hold? As if in answer to her question, the ground began to tremble, the cave walls shaking, the crystal pulsing with a frantic, erratic light. A voice, cold and menacing, echoed through the chamber. "You have discovered the truth, Alpha," the voice said. "But it will not save you. The Silver Covenant will have its reckoning." Alaric drew his sword, his body tensing, his silver eyes blazing with fury. "Who is there?" he demanded, his voice ringing with authority. "Show yourself." A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man dressed in black, his face obscured by a silver mask. He held a weapon in his hand, a crossbow loaded with a silver-tipped arrow, its point aimed directly at Livia. "It is time to end this, Alpha," the man said, his voice cold and cruel. "It is time for the moonbound to fall." He was not alone. Figures slipped from the shadows, and now, the fight was truly on. Chapter 19. The Queen's Choice. The cave erupted in a whirlwind of violence. The Silver Covenant, led by the masked figure, attacked with a ferocity born of centuries of hatred, their weapons specifically designed to harm the moonbound. Alaric, Fueled by his rage and his determination to protect Livia, fought with the power and skill of a seasoned alpha, his sword a blur of silver, his movements precise and deadly. Livia, despite her lack of combat training, found herself swept up in the battle. The ancient magic of the Moonbound, awakened within her by the revelations in the cave, surged through her veins, granting her strength, speed, and a fierce protectiveness. She used the silver dagger, the one that had belonged to her ancestor, deflecting blows, striking at exposed limbs, her movements instinctive and surprisingly effective. The guardians of Whisperwind Glade, alerted by the commotion, joined the fray, their skills honed by centuries of protecting the sanctuary. Nyx, her silver eyes blazing with fury, fought alongside Alaric, their movements synchronized, their combined power a formidable force. But the Silver Covenant were numerous and well-equipped. They pressed their attack, their weapons finding their marks, drawing blood, inflicting wounds. Alaric, despite his strength, was slowly being overwhelmed, his body tiring, his defenses weakening. Livia saw him falter, a silver-tipped arrow grazing his arm, drawing a cry of pain from his lips. She felt a surge of fear, a primal terror that threatened to consume her. She had to protect him, had to save him. She focused her mind, channeling the ancient magic that flowed through her veins. She raised her hand, instinctively, and spoke a word in the language of the wolves, a word of power, a word of command. The air around her shimmered, crackled with energy. A wave of force emanated from her, throwing the attacking Silver Covenant members back against the cave walls, disarming them, stunning them into momentary immobility. But the masked leader, seemingly unaffected by her power, remained standing. He raised his crossbow, aiming the silver-tipped arrow directly at Alaric's heart. "It ends here, Alpha," he snarled, his voice filled with hatred. "The Moonbound will fall, and you will die." Livia knew she had to act, had to make a choice. She could use her magic to try to disarm him, to stop him. But there was a risk, a chance that she might fail, that the arrow might find its mark. There was another way, a more certain way. She could use the bond, the connection between her and Alaric, to shield him. She could draw the arrow to herself, taking the blow, sacrificing herself to save him. It was a choice between her life and his, between her future and his. And in that moment, Livia knew what she had to do. She stepped in front of Alaric, shielding him with her body, her eyes locking with his, her heart filled with love.
"No, Livia,"
Alaric cried, his voice filled with horror and desperation. "Don't." But it was too late. The masked leader released the arrow. It flew through the air, swift and deadly, aimed directly at Livia's heart. Time seemed to slow. Livia felt a sharp, searing pain in her chest, the impact of the arrow knocking her back, her body falling. She saw Alaric's face, contorted with anguish, his silver eyes filled with tears. She heard his cry, a primal scream of grief and rage. But she also felt something else. The bond, the connection between them, pulsing with a fierce, protective energy. The magic of the Moonbound, flowing through her, responding to her sacrifice. The arrow, instead of piercing her heart, shattered against an invisible shield, a barrier of pure energy that surrounded her, protecting her, saving her life. Livia gasped, her body trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She was alive. She was safe.
But how?
She looked at Alaric, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and awe. He reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "The bond, Livia," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion.
"It protected you.
It saved you." Livia realized the truth. The bond was not just a connection, not just a source of power. It was a shield. It was love, in its purest, most powerful form. The masked leader, stunned by this unexpected turn of events, staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear. He had failed. He had underestimated the power of the bond, the strength of their love. Alaric stood, and moved with the speed of death itself. Chapter 20. The Eternal Embrace. Alaric, fueled by a surge of protective fury and the relief of Livia's survival, moved with a speed and ferocity that even the seasoned Silver Covenant warriors could not match. He disarmed the masked leader with a swift, brutal strike, his sword flashing in the dim light of the cave, the sound of clashing metal echoing through the chamber. The remaining Covenant members, demoralized by their leader's defeat and stunned by Livia's display of power, hesitated, their attack faltering. Nyx and the Guardians of Whisperwind Glade seized the opportunity, pressing their advantage, disarming and subduing the remaining attackers. The battle was over, swiftly and decisively. The Silver Covenant, for now, had been defeated. But the cost had been high. Several Guardians were injured, and the masked leader, though alive, was severely wounded. Alaric, his chest heaving, his body covered in sweat and blood, approached the masked man, his sword pointed at his throat. He ripped the mask from his face, revealing the features of a stranger. It was not someone Alaric recognized, not a member of the Moonbound Court, not someone he had ever seen before. The man's face was pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and fear.
"Who are you?"
Alaric demanded, his voice cold and harsh.
"Who sent you?"
The man remained silent, his gaze defiant. Alaric pressed the point of his sword against his throat, drawing a trickle of blood.
"Speak."
Alaric roared, his voice filled with rage. "Tell me who you work for, or I swear, I will." Before Alaric could finish his threat, the man's body convulsed, his eyes rolling back in his head. A dark, viscous fluid seeped from his mouth, and he slumped to the ground, lifeless. Livia, who had been watching the scene unfold, rushed to Alaric's side, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "He's dead," she said, her voice trembling. What happened?" Alaric lowered his sword, his expression grim. "Poison," he said, his voice heavy with disgust. "A failsafe, to prevent him from revealing his secrets. The Silver Covenant, they are ruthless." He turned to Livia, his silver eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softening. "The arrow did it?" Livia shook her head. "I'm fine," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The bond, it protected me. It saved me." She looked down at the silver dagger, still clutched in her hand. It was more than just a weapon, more than just a symbol of her ancestry. It was a testament to the power of the bond, the strength of their love. Nyx approached them, her expression grave. "The threat is neutralized for now," she said. "But the Silver Covenant will not give up. They will return. We must be prepared." Alaric nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant entrance to the cave. "We will be," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "We will be ready for them." He turned back to Livia, his silver eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "We need to leave Whisperwind Glade, Livia," he said. "We need to find a safe place, a place where we can prepare for the coming war. A place where we can build our future." Livia nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The future was uncertain, the path ahead fraught with danger. But she was not afraid. She had Alaric, she had the bond, she had her destiny. As they left the cave, leaving behind the bodies of the fallen and the echoes of the battle, Livia looked back at Whisperwind Glade, at the shimmering waterfall, at the lush vegetation, at the ancient magic that permeated the air. She knew she would never forget this place, this sanctuary that had tested them, strengthened them, and revealed their true selves. They emerged from the ancient woods, the sun setting on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. They stood on a cliff, overlooking a vast valley, a landscape of rolling hills, sparkling rivers, and distant mountains. Alaric took Livia's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver of awareness through her. "We will build our home there, Livia," he said, his voice filled with hope. "A place where we can be safe, where we can be together. A place where we can create our own destiny." Livia looked at him, her husband, her king, her soulmate. She saw the strength in his eyes, the love in his heart, the unwavering determination that had guided them through so much darkness. She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Together, she whispered, her voice filled with love and certainty. We will do it together. They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The bond between them, forged in fire, strengthened by adversity, and sealed by love, pulsed with a vibrant, enduring energy. They were Alaric and Livia, Alpha and Queen, bound by magic, by destiny, by an eternal embrace. Their journey was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together, always together. The wind carried whispers to them, not of warning, but of welcome. Epilogue. Years passed, measured not in the fleeting seasons of the human world, but in the slow, majestic cycles of the moonbound. Alaric and Livia, guided by the ancient wisdom of Wispowind Glade and their own unwavering love, built their new home, a haven nestled in the heart of the valley they had discovered upon leaving the sanctuary. It was not a fortress, not a place of isolation, but a vibrant community, a testament to their vision of a future where moonbound and humans could coexist, not in fear and suspicion, but in harmony and understanding. The threat of the Silver Covenant remained, a persistent shadow lurking on the fringes of their lives, but Alaric and Livia, with the help of the loyal members of their court and the newfound allies they had made among the guardians of Wispowind Glade, were prepared. They had learned from the past, had embraced their strengths, and forged a future where their differences were not a source of conflict, but a source of strength. Livia, once a librarian from a small town, had fully embraced her role as queen. She was no longer the timid, uncertain woman who had stumbled into the moonbound world. She was a leader, a warrior, a protector. She used her knowledge of both the human and moonbound worlds to bridge the gap between them, to foster understanding, to build alliances. Alaric, tempered by the trials he had faced and guided by Livia's unwavering love and wisdom, had become the leader he was always meant to be. He was no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past, no longer burdened by the weight of his ancestors' mistakes. He was a king, not just by birthright, but by merit, by compassion, by vision. The bond between them, once a source of fear and uncertainty, had blossomed into something profound and beautiful. It was not just a connection, not just a source of power. It was the very essence of their being, a testament to their enduring love, their unbreakable unity. And, against all odds, against all expectations, Livia bore a child. A daughter, with Alaric's silver eyes and Livia's dark hair, a child who embodied the best of both worlds, a child who represented the future of the moonbound. They named her Alara, meaning Shining One, a symbol of hope, of light, of the enduring power of love. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Alaric and Livia stood on the balcony of their home, Alara nestled in Livia's arms, her tiny hand clutching Alaric's finger. They looked out at their kingdom, at the thriving community they had built, at the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. "We did it," Alaric, Livia whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "We created our own destiny." Alaric smiled, his silver eyes shining with love and pride. He leaned down and kissed Livia, a tender, passionate kiss that spoke of their enduring love, their unbreakable bond. "Together, Livia," he whispered, his voice echoing her words from that fateful day on the cliff. "We did it together." Alara gurgled, her tiny hand reaching out to touch both of their faces. They looked at their daughter, their future, their hope. And they knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family, as one. The moon rose, casting its silvery light upon the valley, illuminating the home they had built, the love they had shared, the legacy they would leave behind. It was a legacy of courage, of compassion, of understanding. A legacy of love. The night was filled, not only with moonlight, but with the quiet, contented howls of a family at peace. The end.